Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me in another video. So I'm sure many of you at this point, have started watching the Love Story series on Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, John F. Kennedy Jr. Of course, on this channel, we've talked about things like her fashion, her handbags, but what I thought was interesting in this series is they, especially early on, are zeroing in on the little details, including her beauty. Of course, there is an intense focus on what she wore, what she carried, but I also think there is sort of a style of the 90s. I wanted to talk about her beauty products that she wore, 90s beauty essentials. Of course, she didn't wear a lot of makeup, but she wore specific makeup. And some of these products you can still find today, which I think is always interesting. Like, there is a certain enduring appeal about certain products. And when I was watching this series, I couldn't help but think of seeing Sarah Pigeon. To me, I don't immediately see Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, but I think what they're doing in this series is they're trying to get her closer to her in terms of the fashion, in terms of the styling, as well as the beauty. And I think what's interesting is, again, when I look at Sarah Pigeon, to me, she's someone that exudes contemporary beauty that has this kind of like clean girl glow versus the 90s beauty standards, just like a whole different aesthetic happening. Like, each decade has a different look. Of course, it also changes through the decade, which it'll also be interesting to follow as we are watching her in the early 90s to the late 90s. But yeah, I think of right now, a very common beauty trend is that like clean girl look, that very dewy, glossy, glazed look. Like, think of somebody like Hailey Bieber. But yeah, in the 90s, beauty was a little bit different. It was a little bit more matte. It wasn't the high glam of the 80s. Like, there was, I think, this sense of realism throughout the decade. And I thought we talked about some of these products, specific products that she wore, starting off with a very popular product you can still find today. Of course, there has been reformulations of this, but this is MAC Studio Fix Powder Plus Foundation. And of course, this is very much a 90s product. It was launched in 1992. It was used heavily for film sets, fashion shows, fast coverage, matte finish, long wear, and it became a cult favorite. Again, one of the best-selling foundations for decades. And I think this approach to foundation, it's very different from foundation today. And in this like 90s iteration, it's, again, the foundation wasn't like this dewy glazed look, like almost reflective. For Carolyn, what we're seeing in the 90s, there was more of this like soft focus, this like velvety, slightly matte look. In the mid and the later 90s, she would be someone that would be photographed heavily, constantly. She would feel the effects of like flash photography. So she would need something that had oil control coverage, but she didn't want something that was totally caked on her face. But yeah, it's interesting to look at beauty trends of recent, just like skincare trends. You want to show luminous, hydrated looking skin. Whereas like the Studio Fix, the way it was worn in the 90s, it was meant to have more of this like matte look. Another product she wore was Janet Sarton's New York's NYC Compact Powder Foundation. Again, also with the same focus. Now I want to talk about highlighters, because I think when we hear highlighter today, we think of that wet shine look. And I think in the 90s, highlighter, it was done in a way where it was more subtle light correction, maybe a touch of it on the lid, maybe slightly on the brow bone. But it wasn't about these contoured, blinding glows. Think about in the 2020s, or even like more the 2010s, like the idea of like contour and cheek sculpting and having highlighters to give this glow. These types of highlighters were used a little more sparingly. The specific products she wore were the Faye Stockholm highlighters, Radiance and Dignity. Another product that she wore was Bobbi Brown's eyeshadow in the color Bone. And I think what's also interesting in the 90s, as the decade progressed, we also saw her brows would thin out, and doing that, it really like revealed more of her facial structure. The focus of a lot of the beauty, I think, with her wasn't necessarily about like sparkle. It was more to like highlight the structure of her face, which I think is something that we would also see like in her fashion, like the structure of her bags or like the structure of her clothes. Now, when we talk about lips, she famously wore Bobbi Brown's Ruby Stain, which wasn't this like bright red, bright lacquered cherry red. It was a little bit deeper, a softened red with a slightly almost like brownish undertone tone. Again, there's something about like brown lips in the 90s. She wasn't necessarily going for that brown lip look. Like she went more for like berries or red looks. Again, like the ruby stain felt very 90s. Again, it wasn't like the hyper glamour of the 80s, nor was it, I think, the 2020s, like no makeup look. Like she's wearing makeup here, and it looked like she was wearing, especially when it came to lip colors, like she was wearing a lip color. But again, I think she wore in a way that like made her, especially like in the later years, like it just made her look a little bit more polished, but nothing too overpowering. Next, we have her wearing, from the Faces Veil lipstick, she wore the colors cranberry and raspberry. These, again, were also 90 shades, a little bit deeper, slightly brown inflected, but still a little bit more wine than fruity. Would give her a little bit more depth. Another product that she wore was a very popular product in the 90s, was MAC Spice lip liner, a bit more brown base. It gave, again, a little bit more definition. Before contouring was the viral technique, I think in the 90s, like especially if you look at some of the early images of her in the 90s, like something about this like contoured lip liner, subtle definition, just reminds me of the 90s. Another popular product that she wore in the 90s was MAC Cosmetics Mascara X. This is now discontinued. We're not seeing her fan her eyelashes, and they weren't really dramatic, just natural. And if there was more of a pop, it was more in the lip, more like these products would outline her facial features. In terms of nail color, she wore the Face Stockholm's nail polish number 9. This is more of like a muted neutral tone. She wore her nails short, nothing really over the top, nothing like really decorative. And even just in the 90s, as someone like working in fashion, it was like very hands-on in fashion. Whether it be she was pulling product or taking measurements or working behind the scenes at fashion shows, right? She needed to be more hands-on. We wouldn't really see her with like really long nails. It's more of a natural look. Another nail color she wore was Chanel's Rouge Noir, an iconic color from 1994, that like deep oxblood that Chanel is recently celebrating. Like they have a whole campaign going on right now celebrating this color. Honestly, I love this color. I love how it just represents 1994. But yeah, those were the beauty products I wanted to highlight in today's video. And I think what I find so interesting about this 90s minimalism versus I think some of the like 2020s clean girl beauty aesthetic, while I think there are certain aesthetic similarities, like, and I think even in the 2020s has like looked back to this era and to this style, and definitely how Carolyn Bessette is on like many mood boards when it comes to even recent style trends. But just when we look at the beauty, we see how like the clean girl aesthetic was more this like glow focus, the skincare heavy focus. It's layered, might involve like a 10-step skincare routine, yet at the same time it wants to look like it's effortless. Whereas 90s minimalism, it was just really about editing, a matted texture over something glossy to show structure over shine. And of course she had to consider things like paparazzi, flash photography, what was her real life. I think there was also like a sense of like a realism with like the beauty in the 90s. And of course later on in the 90s with like the millennium approaching, again, there was something about also her beauty that wasn't nostalgic. It was something that felt a little bit more modern and forward looking. Overall, when I look at her beauty products, what I love about it is actually how quite easy it is. And it's not necessarily about copying every product. I'm not listing this so that you buy these exact shades. Like there's certain lip products that you won't be able to find. But again, it's more about like, I think, enhancing your features, not necessarily transforming them. It's okay if you want a defined lip, a sharper lip, or even sharper brow, or, you know, defining your brow line. There still was like definition. While she was many times wearing makeup, it wasn't like the first thing you noticed. But yeah, that's my video for today. I'm curious, do you have any of these products? I'm also curious, have you checked out the new series, the Love Story series? Let me know down below. That's my video for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.